Hey everyone, welcome back to Rachel's Studio, and boy do I have a treat for you. My very first collaboration with a fellow YouTuber, Michele Webber, and she is going to paint a flower for you all on this channel that's inspired by a picture I took of a flower in my garden, and I am going to paint on her channel a painting of a black cat, which is inspired by her black cat. So be sure to check out her channel too, because she will be uploading a tutorial of a black cat by me on her channel today as well. Also, if you're interested in trying these paintings, we are both going to upload these reference photos to both our Facebook groups. So I will put all those links in the description below. The links to her Facebook group, my Facebook group, and the link to my tutorial on her channel. Is that everything? I think so. If you enjoy this video, please be sure to like and subscribe to my channel and do the same over at Michele's channel. And now without further ado, here's Michele painting a flower from my garden.
So here I am with Rachel's beautiful Zinnia photograph, and I'm very excited about painting this for you today. I'm going to use a very limited palette. We'll choose colours in a moment. I'm going to do the drawing first of all. Now on my own channel I don't offer downloadable tracings or anything like that because I always teach drawing. However, if you do need this photograph, if you need to trace or use a grid or any other method of transferring, if you just need it for the painting, then you'll find it in Rachel's Facebook group and also in my own Facebook group. So with drawing flowers like this, it's a really simple shape and we don't have to get it perfect. If you're not used to drawing, we don't have to get it perfect because it's a flower. Its own mother doesn't need to recognize it. It just needs to be good enough. So with a flower like this, the important thing is to look at the outside shape. Sort of imagine you were drawing, not a box, but a connection of straight lines around the outside. And then you look for the center point. And here it is way up here. Do you see how much closer it is to the top edge than it is down the bottom here? So if I were drawing, the shape of this flower, it would be something like this with the center up the top. And then once you've got that center point, everything is going to come out to those outside edges, and it just enables you to draw any flower facing in any direction. Obviously that's a very simplified cartoony version, but you can see the process. So here's my outside shape. I found the center point of the flower. Of course it's not in the center, and I've done the shape of this lovely bright pink part in the middle here. I'm going to now start in the middle and start by working up these little petals here. You see these ones, they come up in the middle and they're quite short, and then we're going to start bringing these other ones further out. So you can see how I'm bringing these little strands, these little curled petals up, and I'm thinking at the moment, although I'm not a big user of masking fluid, it can be useful for the centers of flowers, and I'm thinking that I may just use a little masking fluid around these edges here. So I've got a putty eraser here, it's a De Laroni Firm, where I've taken these outer petals and they're sort of crossing over things that go behind them. I can then just erase those little pieces. Now I am not copying every petal exactly across in the right position. That's not important to me. I just want to get an impression of these petals. So I'm looking across, seeing one that I like the look of, that's in the position that I need it, and copying it in. I'm certainly not making sure I've got the exact right number of petals or anything like that. I'm not a botanical watercolorist, although I paint fairly detailed. So nearly finished with the drawing, just continuing to bring out petals wherever I see I want them. Just putting in these nice large petals at the bottom. I'm going to finish my drawing and then we're going to swatch our colours. I'm going to use a really limited palette, but I'll give you some alternatives if you don't have those colours. I'm going to draw one or two leaves in and the stem at the base here, and we'll do a nice loose background. So I shortened the stem a little bit because I've made my flower head a bit bigger and put a couple of leaves in. All I'm doing now is just erasing any construction lines, and next we're going to swatch our colours. So here are the colours I've chosen today. I'm going to swatch them for you. If you see any like this that have little handwritten labels, that's just because they're manufacturer's samples, but you don't have to have these paints to proceed, and one of them is a Daniel Smith colour as well. So they're not all by Jackman's, but the majority are, simply because I have a lot of their paints. So let's start with our first colour. I've chosen Daniel Smith Green Gold. Now you don't have to have any ready mixed greens to do this painting, you can mix your own, but the green gold is a beautiful colour, and see how it just goes down to that transparent sunny greenish yellow. Now if you don't have this colour, you can mix your own by getting something like a phthalo blue and mixing it up with something like a lemon, or even better, something a bit warmer, an Aurolian, a cadmium yellow, even a diarylide could be used. I want you to avoid yellow ochre. It's a great colour for beaches, but it's a bit too mucky and grainy for painting flowers. You want fresh colours. The other green that I've got is this one here. And as I said, you don't have to have any ready mixed greens. You can just mix your own. This is from one of my own sets, and this is called Fresh Green. You can take your own greens and just adjust them, or you can mix your own. Be very careful if you're using anything called Emerald or Viridian or Phthalo Green. You'll need to put a little bit more yellow in that just to stop it being too sort of acid and blue. For my pink, I have chosen quinacridone magenta because it just goes into that slightly blue magenta end of pink. But you can just use something like permanent rose, even a quinacridone pink. You can add a little bit of blue if you need to. For mixing purposes, and just because we always need a dark or two, we've got some ultramarine blue. This is a green shade, ultramarine blue. There's not a huge difference between them, so don't worry too much about that. You can see it's just a little bit less purple than some ultramarines, but a standard ultramarine or even a cobalt will do for this painting. For the background, I've got some burnt sienna, which is just a lovely warm red brown. You could choose any red brown. You could even, if you wanted to, use something like a red oxide or a Venetian red. Any of those oxide reds would do, because if you mix them here with your ultramarine, you can cool them down a little bit as necessary. Finally, to get some of the veins on the petals, some of the detail, without messing around and spending ages with a tiny brush, I've got a watercolor pencil here. Any dark pink or crimson watercolor pencil will do, and what we'll be able to do is put some water on our flower or some paint and just get some lovely soft lines. So we're going to start painting now. It's really important that flower petals look clean. You want to avoid, wherever possible, getting any brown on flowers because it can tend to make them look like they've died. Now there are areas where you've got kind of a reddish brown here. Now what will happen is this will naturally appear as we put our green gold in, and then we overlap it in places with a little bit of the pink. That kind of reddish brown colour will appear. We don't need to paint a separate colour for that. So we're going to do the whole of this flower head with the green gold, with the quinacridone magenta, both watered down and much more strongly in the centre. And I'll also keep a little bit of this blue on hand, just for any areas where we want a little bit of dark. When I'm doing these outside petals, rather than the underneaths which have the green on, I'm going to keep them really clean and pure and stick mostly to just using the quinacridone magenta and fading out to white. And we'll also use a little bit of watercolour pencil. Now graphite pencil can be trapped underneath watercolour, so I want to look at each petal I'm going to paint, and if there's anything that's a bit scruffy there, a little bit of pencil that I don't want in there, I'm just going to take that out. I've actually got 2 water jars. You can't see them, they're off camera, but I've got 2, and that's because I want to make sure that one always has pretty much clean water. And I'm going to start by wetting the end of this petal, and that's because we want a soft edge here. So we don't want hard edges within flower petals. Even when there are strong markings on flowers, there are almost never hard edges within them. And so what I'll do now is I'm picking up some paint, but you'll see that I haven't put a lot of water in it. And what this means is that it won't run everywhere. So I can place it here and bring it up to meet where the edge of the water is. And we should get a fading effect like this without too much movement. In other words, this pink paint is not going to run right the way across to the end. I've also got what we in the UK call kitchen paper towel. It's much discussion on my channel about why we call it kitchen paper. We're not really sure. It remains kitchen paper even when moved into other rooms. So I'm just sort of manipulating now. I can dry my brush when I need to, and making sure that there's not too much bleeding going on here, which we're doing by keeping this paint that we put on fairly dry. So if we look a little more at our photograph, you'll see that the darker pink petals are around the base here and the lighter ones up here where the light is hitting. So we're going to keep them dark around the edge here, and that will give a sense of depth, and also it'll help to make it look curved. I'm going to do another petal now, and we'll think about putting in a little bit of a line in one. We're going to use our watercolor pencil. With that, we're going to paint into wet paint, and this will make the watercolor pencil release more color and give a softer edge. So again, just cleaning up this petal, making sure there's not too much muck in it, and going to start again by wetting the end. You don't need to take the water all the way down. You don't even need to take the water right up to the edge. It can be hard to see where you're putting water, so you can just use the paint once you can see where the paint is to manipulate that across. And being careful not to take this water into the petal next to it. We're taking a little bit of a botanical approach here, because what would happen is one would just run into the other. The paint will follow where the water is, and on this occasion I'm going to keep this fairly separate, at least for these larger petals anyway. And again, I can come down like this and bring this up until we reach the water. The wetter this paint is, the more it will spread, so you can manipulate it. You can use it to make it spread a lot or to stay pretty much where you put it. And we're going to come around here and always going a little bit darker as we come into the center here for that added depth and drama. You can see I'm getting quite a detailed approach here, but it's not a tiny paintbrush. Small paintbrushes don't really hold a lot of water, and you can end up with something that looks far too stilted. So I'm just using this paintbrush to bring the paint along. What I want to do now is get a line on this petal. So I'm going to take my watercolor pencil. The more sharpened it is, the finer the line I'll get, so you can sharpen it or not, depending on what sort of line you would like to achieve. There's more of these lines actually on the underneath of the petals, but I think just for fun we'll have one or two on this petal here as well. I'm going to continue working around. Now, of course, if I did every single petal completely separately, it would take some time. So as we go up to here and we've got that light pink, I can do 2 or 3 at a time and just drop a little bit of dark in as I go. So working up the top here, the colours are much lighter. And we don't have to worry that it's not going to show up against the background, because we're going to have a dark background in later on. So it's all going to be absolutely fine. We can go as pale as we like here, but I will still try and show a little bit of difference between petals. What I can do as well is use a bit of the blue in places, just to get those sort of slightly shadowed areas. You want to go careful with this, because you can end up just, going too far with it and really changing the colour of the flower, which we don't want to do. But it's quite pretty just to drop a tiny touch of ultramarine in. So I want you to notice that I don't paint a petal that's next to a wet petal. So all the time I'm waiting for the one adjacent to dry. So for instance, this one has to be dry before I paint this one or this one. You think that would slow us down, but it doesn't at all, because we can just move around the flower, picking areas that are dry. So already my flower is building up quite quickly. I'm just moving between areas, doing some of these dark petals down the bottom and some of the lighter ones at the top. You'll notice how I always make sure there's a dark edge behind the petal in front. This means that you'll see the difference between the petals. That can be done really simply. If you're not sure which should be lighter or which should be darker, just go for darker on the one behind, as dark colours tend to recede. And again, just working into all of these little areas here, keeping the ones at the top here fairly light, but making sure that we can see which petal is which. I'm going to continue until I've done all of these sort of pure pink areas first, and then I'll be moving on to the pure green areas, and then we'll work into the areas where we've got the green and the pink overlapping. And that way my water and my palette and everything stays very clean. Although the green and the pink do overlap and become brown, we want to keep that very concise and in certain areas, and not allow those muddy colours to pollute all of the petals, which would make them look slightly dead. What I'm going to do next is just use a tiny bit of masking fluid just for these little central green parts here, so that I can paint the red on later on without messing them up. I'm not a huge fan of masking fluid. It can look very unnatural, but I'm just going to use a tiny amount just here in the center. So I've got some Daniel Smith green gold, and I'm going to start painting these little areas in the middle. I guess they're just petals, aren't they? They're just an extension of the petals, but they're the ones closer to the center, and they're sort of almost the reverse of the petals. So some of them just simply light green, so we're just going to water the paint down. And the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up a puddle of this paint, and I'm going to take it across all of the leaves here, just as sort of an underwash. So you can see I've changed to a slightly larger brush here, and I'm going to go in and put that layer across the leaves here, that underwash. And you'll notice as well that I have kept the pink and the green distinctly apart. I'm not using a load of pink water to mix my green paint with. If you don't paint neatly, that's fine too. You can do this tutorial in more of a loose style. Just keep your brush strokes very simple and try not to overblend the colours together. I'm going to do the other leaf, and then we're going to put some of these areas where the red overlaps the green in, and of course do the centre before we move on to the background. So we're going to move on now to doing these areas that are a mixture of green and red. So as I said before, it may look like there's brown in there, but red and green will make brown, or a approximation of brown. So we're going to use those two colours together. There's also a lot of little lines and marks on here, so I've got my watercolour pencil and I've just sharpened it in my turn handle sharpener, and it's got a nice sharp point on there, so we can do some little details with that too. So the way I'm going to do these is I'm going to start by placing the green on and then adding the red for shadow areas and kind of letting the two blend together. So again, whenever you see that you've got excess pencil, you can just remove that, providing the paint is dry. So I'm applying my watered down green just the same as before, but this time what I'm going to do is work some red in. By red I mean the quinacridone magenta, of course. All pinks are forms of red, and just going to pick up some of the red, the pink, and it's not dripping wet, as you can see, and again this will enable me to just place it where I want it and it will stay put. As it mixes with that green, it's going to make more of a muddy red-brown colour. I've got this piece of tissue paper off to the side, and whenever my brush is too wet I just rinse and dab, and that way I can control how much paint I'm using. So I can just spread this colour up as much as I want, and then there are lots of these tiny little marks actually, so I can add some of these as well if I want to. Just like before, I'll avoid working next to one that I've just painted, and you can see that some of these have an inside part as well which is more pink, so again I can let that outside bit dry and then pop some colour on the inside later. Straight in with the red. You want to keep these shadow areas towards the base, towards the back, towards the area that curves underneath or goes down low, which is why we started off using pure colours, so that we didn't end up with everything looking muddy and dirty. We've got those nice pure colours that will contrast against these more earthy tones. So making sure the outside part, the green part, is dry before I drop the pink into the middle here. Just a very watered down pink, and then what you want to do is just get a little bit of dark where the deepest part of the inside would be. You can look at your photograph for reference, and really just the tiniest amount of thick paint on the edge there, and just dropping that in like so, and that will help to make it look a little bit more three-dimensional. Now before I ditch this colour combination entirely, I'm going to paint the stem in the centre here. So I'm going to go in again with the green gold. I'm also going to add a little bit of ultramarine to it, just at the base here. And we're also going to work in with our watercolour pencil and get those little marks again on the stem that are somewhat similar to what we see on the flower itself. The next thing we're going to do is to put the dark red in the centre here, and I'm just going to paint around the middle. I'm going to go straight over all of that masking fluid that I placed on. That's what it's for. Later on we'll remove that, and then we'll paint a little bit of light green in the gaps. Notice how we're not going too circular here. We're allowing that colour to sort of go around the little bits that are protruding into that area, so that we've got a nice natural look. And just to give it some depth now, I'm going to rinse my paintbrush, and then I'm just going to take a little bit of colour out of this far edge here, and then before it dries I'm just going to go into the centre with a little bit of dark blue, and you'll be amazed actually that it will just help to give that depth in the centre. I've got some sort of little seed tape shapes in the middle there, so I won't put it in too blocky. I'm going to actually just follow some of the shapes that I see, maybe even put a little bit of dark around the edge here too, like that. Before I move on to the leaves, I feel it could be a little bit darker in the center here, just down at the base, this area here. So what I'm going to do is just in one or two places, just put a little bit of clean water on, and I'm just going to use the watercolor pencil just to darken those areas. While I wait for those center areas to dry, what I'm going to do now is put a bit more color on my leaf. So we're going to mix the green gold. I'm also going to use a little bit of this ultramarine green shade, and what I'll do then is I'll work on top, and we'll use that underneath layer that we put on the leaves to kind of show through at the end. You can see how I indicated sort of a center line here. So what we can do is we can come in with this darker color, and we can keep that center line as our sort of vein so that it's not too flat. I'm going to go in above with a little bit more of the green gold so that we get some variation in this leaf color. I'll also be using an area like this to just sort of shape the underneath of the leaf. Underneath of leaves tend to be a little bit bluer and softer and lighter. So I'm just going to put a bit of clean water on there. I'm going to get a bit more of the blue, but also a bit more water. And then I'm just going to take it along the base here and let it fade up to the top. I'm going to carry on and put some more darks on these leaves, allowing these light areas to show through as the veins. So when I come down here, I will paint around that leaf vein. You could of course use masking fluid on top of the dry paint if you will find that easier. Now originally I think what I had planned to do was to use the fresh green colour on the leaves, but I've gone in with the ultramarine. Now we could just stick with those colours, but I think I would like to put some of the fresh green in the background. Now I'm going to do a really simple wet into wet background, just, you know, taking this for inspiration. I've got some brown here, I've got some green here, and some other little bits of pink. I could also put some blue in if I wanted to. I'll try not to turn my board too much whilst I'm painting, but if you're doing this at home, it's much easier for you to turn the board as you go. All we're going to do is just drop colours in and allow them to bleed on the paper. I'll be using a bigger brush if I need to in places. Don't want to do this with too small a brush. You'll notice I'm going directly onto dry paper here. There's no need to pre-wet. All you do then is you water down the paint. There are occasions when you need to pre-wet your work, but this is not one of them. And I'm just going to allow these colours to sit on the paper. Now see how that colour there, there's not a lot of difference between one and the other. So that would be a good time for me to go in with something else, some blue or even some pink. When mixed with green, it will give you a nice grey colour. So if you just find that things just aren't showing enough, you could go in with a little bit of that red colour, like so. You see how it changes to purple and grey as it hits the blue and the green. I'm going to continue this background and go all the way around. If you have a dark area, you probably want to go light with the background there. And here we have some light edges of petals. We're going to go really dark behind them. It's going to really show them up. So I've changed to a bigger brush here, and you can see how I'm just using the point of that brush to go neatly around the edge, going in with some of these browns just to make it a bit more interesting. You can go back if you want to. If you want some sort of backgrounds and lines appearing, you can go back into damp paint with wet paint. You'll notice as I work around, I keep this leading edge here wet, because otherwise what will happen is you'll get some sort of strange drying lines. So when you start an area like this, you want to sort of commit to carrying on until it's finished, and try not to have to stop to answer the door or the telephone or something like that. So there it is, finished. It's rather dark here in the UK at this time of year, so I'm working under artificial lights, and it's not dry yet either. The paper's still a little bit bumpy. So if you'd like to see a photograph of it all nice and bright and clear, I'll put that up on my Instagram and in my Facebook group.
Wow, that was so fantastic. Thank you so much, Michele, for sharing your talent and your knowledge here on my channel. And remember, go check out that black cat painting that I'm going to be doing over on her channel. Be sure to like and subscribe on both channels. We really appreciate it. Check out both our Facebook groups where you can see the reference photos. Both Michelle and I have Patreons, so if you are interested in further content from us, go check out our Patreons. Those links are in the description too. And if you would like to watch me do a flower tutorial, I don't do many of them, but I've got a couple, and I'll link one of them here. You can go check that out, and I hope you enjoy that. Now go watercolor your world.